The cowboy adopted a lost Apache girl who turned out to be a gorgeous Apache widow's daughter. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The New Mexico territory stretched wide and dry, the late afternoon sun flattening everything it touched. Dust clung to the air, shifting in small swirls with each gust of wind. A man rode slowly across the scrubland on a bay horse, his body moving heavily in the saddle. Shoulders broad, a dark beard covering a face that had seen too much weather and too many losses. His name was Caleb, a rancher who had once lived for more than just survival. Years ago, he had buried a wife and the unborn child she carried beneath a cottonwood near the edge of his land. Ever since then, the cabin he returned to each night felt like a hollow shell. He did his chores, mended fences, and kept cattle alive, but every task was done with a kind of grim duty, not hope. That day, he wasn't riding for pleasure. He was checking a stretch of fence that often sagged after storms and making sure no strays had wandered too far. His gun belt rested at his side, though he rarely touched it anymore. He wanted nothing to do with fights or men's arguments, having learned long ago that death came too easily on the frontier, and he had no wish to invite more of it. On the edge of a low ridge, he noticed movement. At first, he thought it was a wild animal, thin, stumbling, out of place against the open ground. But as his horse crested the rise, he saw it clearly. A child, small, barefoot, her legs scratched raw, her skin darkened by sun and dust. She wore a ragged piece of cloth that might once have been a dress. She couldn't have been older than 4. Caleb froze in the saddle, one hand resting on the reins, the other on his thigh. His heart thumped harder than he liked to admit. This land carried all kinds of dangers. A child alone meant something terrible had happened. His mind filled with the possibilities. Raid, sickness, abandonment. He scanned the horizon in every direction, waiting for signs of others. Riders, smoke, movement. Nothing, just a dry wind carrying the sound of his horse's breath. The girl stumbled, nearly falling, then caught herself and kept moving without direction. Caleb swung down from the saddle. His boots struck hard dirt, the sound carrying in the silence. He knew better than to rush. She was trembling, eyes darting, lips cracked from thirst. He raised one hand, showing he carried no weapon. "Easy," he said, voice low and steady. The word might mean nothing to her, but tone mattered. She froze, feet planted, as if she had nowhere left to run. Caleb felt a knot in his chest, not only from pity, but from memory. Years ago, when raiders struck a nearby settlement, he had seen women and children wandering just like this, with that same look of shock, of being cut loose from anything familiar. He hated remembering it, but here it was again in the form of one tiny girl. He knelt, bringing himself level with her. Her eyes, dark and frightened, met his, though only for a heartbeat before flicking down again. She held a strip of cloth in her fist like it was the only thing keeping her alive. "You're alone," he muttered, not expecting her to answer. Damn. He thought about leaving her there, not because he wanted to, but because he knew what it would mean to take her in. She wasn't his responsibility. Bringing her home meant danger. People in town had little patience for Apache children, and if word spread, he'd be marked by their prejudice as well. But he also knew she wouldn't last another night alone in the open. Coyotes, raiders, or cold would take her. Decision tightened in him. He opened his arms slowly. For a moment, she hesitated, body rigid. Then something gave way inside her. She stumbled forward and pressed herself against him. Her body felt shockingly light, bones sharp beneath skin. Caleb wrapped his arms around her, felt her clutch his shirt with both fists. He exhaled, steadying himself, knowing he had just chosen a path he couldn't walk back from. He carried her to the horse. She flinched when the animal snorted, but Caleb whispered low to both child and beast, calming them. He set her in the saddle before climbing up behind, her small back pressed against his chest. She said nothing, only held still, the ragged cloth still gripped tight. He guided the horse toward home, each mile dragging heavily. As they rode, Caleb's thoughts worked hard. Who was she? Where'd she come from? Was someone looking for her? The way she clung to him told him enough. She had no one, at least not anymore. He remembered the grave under the cottonwood, the emptiness of his cabin, the long nights of silence. Something inside him shifted. He didn't like how much it hurt or how much it reminded him of what he had lost. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun had dropped low, the logs glowing with the last of daylight. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. He dismounted and carried her inside, pushing the door open with his shoulder. The air smelled of wood smoke and old leather. The cabin was small, one main room with a stove, a rough-hewn table, and a bed pushed against the wall. He set her on a folded quilt near the hearth. She sat without protest, legs drawn up, arms around herself. Caleb poured water into a tin cup and offered it. She snatched it with both hands, drinking fast until water spilled down her chin. He let her, though he slowed her with a hand when she choked. He boiled beans in an iron pot, stirring slowly. When they softened, he fed her small spoonfuls. She ate like she hadn't seen food in days, coughing once before slowing down. He stayed patient, holding the spoon steady until her belly eased. After, he went to a shelf and pulled down something he hadn't touched in years, a rag doll. His wife had sewn it in hopes of filling the cradle that never held a child. Caleb had kept it only because he couldn't bear to throw it away. Now, handing it over felt strange, like giving away a piece of something unfinished. The girl reached out and clutched it, pressing it to her chest. Her breathing slowed, shoulders relaxing for the first time since he had found her. She curled up with the doll against the quilt, eyelids heavy. Within minutes, she was asleep, the crackle of the fire covering her soft breaths. Caleb sat in his chair, leaning forward, hands clasped. He watched her, felt the weight of choice settle heavier than before. He had wanted to live alone, to stay away from ties, from pain. But life had just handed him something different. He thought about taking her to town, but that meant questions he couldn't answer and stares he didn't want. No, he knew already he wasn't letting her go. He glanced at the grave out back through the window, the mound just visible in fading light. He wondered what his wife would have thought, what she would say about a child sleeping by their fire. His chest tightened, but he let the thought stay. The girl shifted once, clutching the doll tighter, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel entirely empty. The morning broke gray with a thin chill creeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. Caleb woke early, as always, the habit of years making him rise before the sun. The fire had burned low, only faint coals glowing in the ash pan. He pushed Sis' chair where he had slept half sitting and looked toward the hearth. The child was still there, curled up tight, the rag doll pressed against her chest. She hadn't moved much through the night, but now her breathing was even and steady. For the first time since he had found her, she looked safe. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside into the dim light. The land was quiet except for the faint rustle of brush in the breeze. His horse stamped near the post, and the cattle down by the creek gave off their low calls. He carried water from the barrel inside, set it on the stove, and added wood until flames stirred again. The smell of smoke filled the room, warm and familiar. When the girl stirred, she sat up quickly, eyes wide, clutching the doll as if it might vanish. Caleb stayed back, not wanting to startle her. He simply nodded once and said, "Morning." She blinked at him, uncertain, but didn't cry. He set a tin cup of warm water near her quilt and motioned for her to drink. She watched him closely, then reached out with both hands and took it. Questions burned at the edges of his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? Was someone still looking for her? The night before, he had chosen to keep her under his roof because the alternative meant certain death for her. But he knew it couldn't end there. A child wandering alone meant a family torn apart. He had to consider the chance that her people might come searching and what that might mean for him. He thought about the town, a half-day's ride away. Men there already looked at him with suspicion since he kept to himself. Bringing an Apache child into the open would stir questions and, worse, judgment. He wasn't sure yet what he would say when those questions came. He gave her beans left over from the night before, warmed in the pan. She ate slowly this time, glancing at him after each bite as if waiting for permission. He noticed how thin her arms were, the way her shoulders hunched forward from exhaustion. She was a survivor already, but only barely. He remembered nights after raids when he had seen women and children in the same state, half-starved, half-broken, but still clinging to life. Something inside him hardened again. He wouldn't let her fall to that fate. After she ate, he pulled on his hat and stepped out to the yard, motioning for her to follow. She hesitated but then trailed after him, clutching the doll tightly. He led her to the trough, filled a small bucket, and showed her how to splash water on her face. She copied him, shivering at the cold, but she didn't complain. He crouched, handed her a rag, and wiped some of the dirt from her cheeks. Up close, he could see she had scratches on her legs and a bruise darkening near her knee. She didn't pull away from his touch, which told him she was already beginning to trust him. As he worked, his thoughts pressed harder. He realized he had given her no name to call him by, and she hadn't spoken a word. Maybe she didn't understand English, or maybe she was simply too frightened. He wondered what name her mother had given her and if she would ever tell him. He didn't push. Silence was something he understood better than most. Back inside, he set her near the hearth again and reached for his coat. He had work to do. The cattle needed watching, and the fences couldn't be ignored. But he couldn't leave her alone. Not yet. He knelt in front of her, gesturing toward the quilt and the fire. "Stay here," he said slowly, pointing to the ground. She looked at him with wide-open eyes, clutching the doll tighter, but gave the faintest nod. He saddled his horse and rode a quick loop around the property. Heart uneasy the entire time. Every shadow looked like danger, every sound like the possibility of raiders returning. He knew the stories. Apache families displaced, women widowed, children stolen or killed. If this girl had been left behind after an attack, then somewhere out there was a mother grieving. He thought about that, and the weight of it settled heavily. He had lost a wife, an unborn child, and the thought of a woman wandering, believing her little one gone, made his chest tighten. When he returned, the cabin door was still shut, smoke curling from the chimney. He stepped inside to find her right where he had left her, the doll in her lap. She looked at him as if to make sure he hadn't abandoned her. He gave her a short nod, and for the first time he saw her shoulders loosen. Later that afternoon, he set her on the porch to feel the sun while he chopped wood nearby. Each swing of the axe was heavy, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. She sat still, legs pulled to her chest, but her eyes moved constantly, scanning the land, alert to every noise. It was the look of someone who expected danger at every turn. Caleb felt anger burn low in him, not at her, but at the men who had left her like this. She was only a child, yet she carried the weight of fear as if she had lived through years of it. That evening, as the sky turned orange, he sat at the table with her across from him. He tore bread in half and handed her a piece. Their hands touched briefly, and he felt her small fingers tighten before pulling away. It struck him how natural it felt to share a meal across that old table again. For years, he had eaten alone, the chair opposite him empty. Now, even in silence, there was company. As the fire burned down that night, Caleb leaned back in his chair, the girl asleep once more on the quilt. He thought of the grave outside and of the woman who lay beneath it. He had promised himself never to open his heart again, never to carry the weight of another soul depending on him. But here it was, forced upon him by circumstance, and he couldn't deny that he had already made his choice. The girl wasn't going anywhere. Still, he knew the truth. If she had a mother, that mother would come. And when she did, Caleb would have to face whatever came with her. He didn't know yet if it would bring peace or more grief. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away. He had taken this child in, and no matter what questions came, he would stand by that choice. That night, with the desert wind pressing against the cabin walls, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of responsibility tied not to duty alone, but to something deeper. He didn't call it hope, he wasn't ready for that, but he felt the stir of it all the same, and it kept him awake long into the night. The next day came with a hard wind rattling across the scrubland, the kind of sound that carried far and made the cabin walls creak. Caleb stepped outside before sunrise, scanning the horizon the way he always did, though now he looked with sharper caution. The child was inside, still asleep, the doll clutched tightly. He worried about leaving her even for minutes, but the livestock demanded care. He moved fast, hauling water, checking the corral, all the while his mind circling the same questions. Who had left her? Where was her family? And most pressing of all, was someone out there looking for her? By mid-morning, the girl had followed him outside, her small bare feet leaving prints in the dust. He set her on the porch with a blanket while he split logs. She watched in silence, her eyes wide but calmer than before. Caleb noticed how she leaned against the wall of the cabin, keeping it at her back as if she needed something solid behind her. He remembered soldiers after war carrying that same instinct, never trusting open ground. For a child to live with that kind of fear made his stomach knot. He set the axe down and crouched by her. "You got a name?" he muttered, though he didn't expect an answer. She blinked, lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came. He touched his chest lightly. "Caleb." He waited. She stared, then looked down, no reply. He let it go, forcing her wouldn't help. Inside, he warmed beans and bread. When he slid the plate to her, she glanced up with a flicker of something he hadn't seen yet. Hesitation, almost like shame. She was used to hunger, that much was clear, but not to someone offering food every time she reached for it. He pushed the plate closer. She ate small bites at first, then faster until she slowed again. He noticed her eyes soften slightly, a trace of trust beginning to show. That afternoon, as Caleb worked on patching the corral, the girl suddenly stiffened and looked toward the ridge. He followed her gaze and saw a figure moving through the brush, walking slowly but with purpose. His hand went to the rifle leaning nearby, instincts firing sharply. The figure drew closer, the shape resolving into a woman. Bronze skin, hair long and black, braided with strips of leather. Her dress was deerskin, fringed with beads, but torn across the front and dusty from hard miles. Her body swayed with exhaustion, but her steps didn't falter. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He knew before she spoke who she must be. He looked at the girl who had frozen, eyes locked on the approaching woman. Then with a sudden burst of sound, the child cried out and stumbled forward, running straight into her arms. The woman dropped to her knees, clutching the girl to her chest, her thin arms trembling with the force of it. The sound that came from her was half sob, half laugh. She pressed her face into the child's hair, murmuring words Caleb couldn't understand but recognized as full of relief. She pulled back just enough to scan the girl, touching her face, her arms, as if making sure every part was still there, then clutched her again, unable to let go. Caleb stood a few paces away, the rifle lowered, heart pounding. He saw the truth in the woman's eyes when she finally looked up at him. She had thought her daughter lost. The grief still clung to her, worn into her bones, but now it was broken open by shock and relief. She rose unsteadily, holding the girl in one arm, her other hand bracing her side. Caleb saw then how thin she was, how her collarbone pressed sharply against skin, how the torn seam of her dress revealed not only curves but bruises and rawness from travel. He looked away for a moment, giving her dignity, then forced his voice steady. "She was alone. I found her 2 days back." The woman's lips parted, and she answered in broken English, "You keep her safe." Her voice cracked, hoarse from thirst and silence. Caleb nodded once. "She's been fed. Warm." She swayed, and he stepped forward before she fell. She resisted his arm at first, proud, but then her strength gave out, and she let him steady her. He guided her toward the cabin. Inside, he cleared the chair for her, set her down carefully, and poured water into a tin cup. She drank fast, just as the girl had, until she coughed. He steadied the cup, slowing her. The girl clung to her mother's side, still clutching the doll, eyes darting between them. Caleb realized the child's silence hadn't been from lack of voice. It had been from fear. Now she murmured softly against her mother's shoulder. Small words in Apache, her first sound since he'd found her. Caleb leaned against the table, arms folded, trying to piece through the questions burning in his mind. He asked quietly, "What happened?" The woman's eyes darkened. "Raiders," she said, "they kill my husband." Her words came haltingly but clearly enough. She touched the girl's head. "I thought my daughter gone. I search. Always search." Her voice shook, but she steadied it with will. Caleb lowered his gaze, jaw tight. He knew that kind of loss, knew the look in her eyes too well. He thought of the grave behind the cabin, the years of emptiness after. The woman's pain struck him hard because it was familiar. For a moment, The cabin was silent, but for the crackle of the fire and the girl's soft murmurs. Caleb understood then that everything had changed again. He had taken in a child he thought had no one. Now the mother stood in his cabin, alive but hollowed by grief, staring at him with weary eyes that asked more than words ever could. He made a choice, the same way he had 2 nights before, with no hesitation once the truth stood in front of him. "You'll both stay," he said simply, voice firm. The woman blinked, startled, as though she hadn't expected kindness from a stranger. Her lips trembled, but she nodded slowly. The girl pressed closer to her, comforted, but her eyes kept flicking to Caleb, not with fear this time, but with recognition. That night, the cabin held 3 people instead of 2. The girl slept between them on the quilt, the mother's arm around her, while Caleb sat by the fire, silent, watchful. He thought about how quickly his world had shifted, how he had gone from years of solitude to this, 2 lives now bound to his. Though the weight of it pressed heavily, he felt something else beneath it, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. The sense that the cabin was no longer just a place for survival, but the beginning of something he didn't dare name yet. The first morning with the widow in his cabin was tense and quiet. Caleb woke before dawn, as he always did, and found himself listening to the faint sound of the woman's breathing where she lay near the hearth with her daughter. The child slept curled against her mother's chest, the rag doll wedged between them. The sight of them together, the girl no longer alone, the woman no longer wandering, brought a tightness to Caleb's chest he hadn't expected. For years, his cabin had been filled with silence, but now there were 2 sets of breaths, soft and steady, carrying through the room. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, needing the cold air to clear his head. The land was still, the horizon streaked with pale light. He fed the horse, hauled water, and checked the corral, but his mind stayed back at the cabin. He wondered if she would want to leave soon, if she had people she could return to, or if she would stay. The question pressed hard because he knew what people in town would say if they saw her here. An Apache woman living under his roof would draw stares, talk, and likely trouble. But he also knew she had nowhere else to go, not now. And the truth was, he didn't want her to go. He had seen the way she held her child the night before, trembling with relief. He understood what it meant to lose and then regain something precious. When he stepped back inside, she was awake. She sat up slowly, her hair loose from the braid, falling in dark waves over her shoulders. Her dress was still torn at the seam, dipping low across her chest, but she seemed too exhausted to care. She looked at him warily at first, unsure of his intentions, then down at her daughter, who stirred but did not wake. Caleb poured water into a tin cup and set it beside her. She took it with a nod, her hand trembling as she drank. "Thank you," she said, her English broken but clear. Her voice was low, husky from thirst and long silence. He pulled a chair closer to the fire sitting across from her. He knew there were things left unspoken that needed answers, things anyone watching this moment would ask. He asked gently, "You have people, family?" She shook her head, eyes dropping. "No, only husband. He gone." Her voice caught, but she forced herself steady. She placed her hand on her daughter's hair. "Only her now." Caleb leaned back, rubbing his jaw. The truth was plain. She had no one else. That meant his earlier promise held more weight than ever. She wasn't just passing through. This was likely the only place she could remain without being swallowed by the desert. She lifted her eyes again, studying him with quiet intensity. "Why you help her? Not your child?" The question landed heavily. Caleb thought about how to answer. He could have said it was duty or decency or chance, but the truth was harder. "Because I couldn't walk away," he said finally. He looked at the fire, not her. "Because I know what it means to lose a family. I wouldn't let her go through it alone." She was silent for a long time, and in that silence, something shifted. Her suspicion didn't vanish, but her shoulders loosened slightly. She understood loss. She could see it in his eyes the same way he saw it in hers. As the day went on, their lives fell into a kind of rhythm. Caleb split wood, and she gathered pieces, stacking them by the stove. When he brought in water, she used it to wash her daughter's face and hair. She found his needle and thread and mended the cuff of his shirt where it had torn, her hands quick despite weariness. She even tried to adjust her own dress, pulling the seam higher, but the cloth was too frayed to hold. Caleb forced himself not to stare when the fabric slipped, though he noticed the way her figure filled the space of his small cabin, the way her presence unsettled and steadied him at the same time. In the afternoon, he saddled his horse to check the far fence. He hesitated before leaving, then pointed to the latch on the door. "Stay inside, bolted if you hear anything." She nodded, pulling her daughter close. When he returned hours later, they were still there, the girl asleep, the woman sitting in the chair by the fire. She looked up at him when he entered, not startled, just watchful. He realized then that she had trusted him enough not to run. That night, the three of them ate together at the table. Caleb broke bread and handed her a piece. Their fingers brushed, and she didn't pull back immediately. She tore the bread into small pieces, giving the first bite to her daughter, then eating herself. For a moment, the cabin felt like something it hadn't in years, a home. After the girl slept, Caleb sat in his chair while the widow rested on the quilt. The firelight lit her face, tired but strong. She looked at him and said quietly, "You alone long time." He nodded once, "Since my wife died." The words were hard, but he said them. He didn't talk about her grave out back, but his eyes flicked toward the window where the cottonwood stood, and the widow followed his gaze, understanding. She gave a slow nod, her own grief mirrored in her eyes. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was shared, heavy with what they both had lost. For the first time since she arrived, her body eased. She leaned slightly toward the fire, and when her shoulder brushed against his boot, she didn't pull back. He didn't move either. That night, as the flames died low, Caleb realized the questions he had been asking, whether she would stay, whether this was temporary, no longer mattered. She was here. Her daughter was here. The cabin no longer belonged only to his grief. It belonged to something new, fragile but real. Though he didn't say it aloud, he knew the truth. He wasn't going to let them go. The days settled into a pattern, but each one felt heavier with meaning than the last. Caleb noticed the changes first in the small details. How the girl now laughed softly when he fed the chickens. How the widow began to hum faint songs while she mended torn cloth. How the cabin smelled different when a pot of stew simmered with roots and dried herbs she had brought from her own pouch. It was no longer just a space. It was slowly turning into theirs. The questions that had gone unanswered in the first nights now pressed closer. Caleb wondered if raiders still lurked nearby, the same men who had torn her life apart. He also wondered if townsfolk would hear of her and come question him, a white rancher living with an Apache woman and child. It was not something people would overlook easily, but the widow's presence, thin and proud, reminded him that survival was not something to be negotiated with society. It was a fact. She had nowhere else, and he had chosen not to let them wander back into the desert. That decision, though silent, stood firm. One evening, the wind rose sharply across the plains. Caleb returned late, dragging a deer carcass behind the horse. He found the widow crouched by the hearth, stirring stew with one hand while steadying her daughter with the other. The neckline of her dress had torn again from the day's labor, dipping lower, and though she adjusted it at once, she seemed to lack the strength to care much about modesty anymore. Caleb turned away quickly, ashamed of the heat that surged through him at the sight. He busied himself with hanging the meat and washing his hands, though his thoughts were not steady. After supper, when this girl slept, the widow remained by the fire. Her hair, once tightly braided, now hung loose, black strands falling over her shoulders. She sat quietly, turning the rag doll in her hands as if mending it with her fingers alone. Caleb sat across from her, arms folded, staring into the flames. The silence between them stretched long, but unlike before, it no longer felt tense. It felt expectant. She finally lifted her eyes to him. "You care for her?" she said, nodding toward the girl asleep on the quilt. Her English was broken but steady. Caleb met her gaze. "She needed someone. You weren't here yet." He paused, then added softer, "Didn't mean to take your place." The widow's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, but close. "You did not take. You gave back." The words landed deeply. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, searching for what to say. He thought about how in town men would speak crudely about Apache women, treating them as less than human, something to buy or discard. He hated those words. Looking at her now, thin, weary yet resilient, he wanted to say so. Instead, he settled on something simpler. You've kept her alive. You've done more than I could. She looked down, shaking her head. I almost lost her. I thought gone. Her hand rose to cover her face, shoulders trembling. Caleb instinctively reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. Her skin was warm, roughened by travel, but soft beneath his calloused palm. She didn't pull away for a long moment. They stayed like that, his hand covering hers, the fire crackling between them. Then she exhaled, steadying herself, and let her hand turn slightly, her fingers brushing against his. It was a small gesture, but it carried more weight than words. Later that night, when he shifted to rise, she leaned toward him instead of back. Their shoulders touched. The air grew heavy in the small cabin. Caleb turned his head, and before he could second guess, his lips brushed against hers. The kiss was brief, tentative, but when he pulled back, her eyes held his steadily, not in fear, but in quiet acceptance. The sound of the child stirring broke the moment. They parted, each retreating into silence, but the unspoken truth lingered. Something had shifted. That night, Caleb lay awake in his bed, staring at the dark ceiling. He thought of his wife, of the grave under the cottonwood. Guilt rose, sharp and unwelcome, but alongside it came another truth. He was alive, and the woman and her child, asleep near his fire, were alive. They had chosen to stay, and he had chosen to let them. He wondered if that alone was enough to begin again. The next morning, he found the widow outside, spreading a deer hide to dry in the early sun. She glanced up at him, her hair whipping in the wind, and for the first time, she smiled. It was faint, but it was real. Caleb felt something loosen in him then, something he hadn't felt in years. He didn't call it happiness, not yet, but it was close enough to shake him. In town, there would be questions. Among neighbors, there would be judgment. He knew all of that lay ahead. But standing there watching her work beside the cabin as her daughter played in the dirt with the rag doll, Caleb felt the answer as plain as the land under his boots. Whatever came, he would not send them away. The following days moved with the rhythm of survival, but under the surface, everything had changed. The first kiss lingered like a mark they both carried without speaking of it. Caleb noticed the widow glanced at him differently now, her eyes steady when they met his, her silence no longer just watchfulness, but something that weighed between them. He kept his hands busy, splitting logs, tightening fences, checking livestock, because stillness left too much space for thoughts he wasn't ready to name. It was during one of those long days that the child fell ill. At first, it was only a cough, a dry sound in the night. By the second day, her forehead burned with fever, her small body shivering under the quilt. The widow panicked, pressing damp cloths to her daughter's skin, whispering in their language, words Caleb didn't understand, but recognized as desperate prayers. Caleb stayed calm on the outside, fetching water, stoking the fire, but inside his chest tightened hard. He had buried one child already before it was born. He would not stand by and lose another. He thought through what he knew. In a town, there was a doctor, but bringing an Apache child there meant questions, suspicion, and maybe worse. He weighed the risk in silence. When the widow caught his arm, eyes wide with fear, she whispered, "She die." Her voice cracked, breaking. Caleb shook his head firmly. "No, not if I can help it." He brewed a tea of willow bark and herbs he had stored from his own supplies, feeding it to the girl slowly, drop by drop, holding her head steady while the widow supported her small body. The hours stretched into a blur of damp cloths, whispered words, and Caleb's deep voice, speaking softly to keep both mother and child from breaking. He didn't let himself rest. Each time the fever spiked, he added wood to the fire, fetched fresh water, changed the cloth. The widow pressed against him once, her face buried against his chest when her daughter shook with chills. He wrapped one arm around her, steadying her without hesitation. The torn dress slipped further at her shoulder, baring skin, but neither of them thought of modesty. Fear left no room for it. 2 nights passed before the fever finally broke. The girl's breathing eased, her body no longer shaking but resting heavily against the quilt. Caleb sat back on his heels, exhaustion hitting him like a blow, but relief heavier still. The widow wept openly, clutching her daughter close. Then, without warning, she turned and kissed Caleb with force, her lips pressed hard against his, as if pouring every shred of fear, gratitude, and need into him. He froze for only a second before kissing her back, his hand steady at her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, the fire crackling low beside them, her body leaning into his, warm and trembling. When she finally pulled back, her breath uneven, her eyes held his with raw intensity. "You save her," she whispered. "You save me." Caleb's throat was tight. He had no words that felt enough. He only reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his rough hand lingering against her cheek. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at her daughter. The child stirred faintly, clutching the doll, then fell into peaceful sleep. That night, the widow didn't retreat to her place by the hearth. Instead, when the child finally slept deeply, she moved closer to Caleb. They sat shoulder to shoulder by the fire, their hands touching in the space between. The silence was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with everything they couldn't yet say out loud. In those hours, Caleb wrestled with questions he knew others would ask if they could see inside his cabin. Why did he have to hold her? What future could there be when the nearest town would sneer at her presence? But as he watched her lean against him, exhausted but alive, and her daughter safe between them, he realized the questions didn't matter. What mattered was here in front of him. By dawn, the child's fever had passed completely. She woke weak but smiling faintly, whispering in her own tongue. The widow kissed her forehead, tears shining, then turned her gaze to Caleb. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes was clear. They had crossed something together that couldn't be undone. Caleb stood slowly, joints stiff, and looked around the cabin. It was still the same walls, the same old stove, the same roof patched with mismatched boards. But the air felt different. The silence that had once belonged to his grief alone now carried new weight. Hers, the child's, and his own willingness to stay bound to both. Later, while chopping wood, Caleb thought of the grave under the cottonwood and wondered if his wife would forgive him for letting someone else into his heart. He didn't know the answer, but he knew this. Life had been forced into his cabin again, and he was no longer a man who could pretend otherwise. As he carried the wood back inside, the widow glanced at him, her eyes tired but strong, her lips faintly curved. She reached for the pot to stir the stew, her torn dress slipping as she leaned, but this time she did not pull it back in haste. Caleb's gaze lingered a moment longer than before, then returned to the fire. He felt the stir of something he hadn't allowed in years. Desire, yes, but also the fragile shape of a future forming in silence. The cabin had survived the storm of fever. Now it held more than survival. It held the beginning of belonging. The fever had passed, and with it the constant fear of losing the child. But Caleb knew there were other dangers waiting beyond the walls of his cabin. Inside, for a short time, things felt steady. The widow moved through the small space with more ease, no longer watching him with suspicion at every turn. She tended the fire, cooked meals from what little he hunted, and began repairing the seams of her dress and the blankets that had frayed. The girl's laugh had returned, soft at first, then fuller, the sound carrying through the cabin like something long missing. Caleb found himself pausing during chores just to listen. But outside, eyes were coming, and he knew it. The land wasn't empty. Ranchers, traders, and hunters passed through, and news traveled fast. If anyone saw an Apache woman and child living in his cabin, questions would follow. Questions led to judgment, and judgment out here could turn dangerous. Still, when he looked at the woman sitting by his hearth, her daughter pressed against her side, he felt the same decision he had made the first night. He would not send them away. The first test came when a trader rode in late one morning. Caleb had gone out to haul water from the creek when a man appeared, a mule trailing behind with sacks of grain. The trader, a lean man with a sharp face, greeted Caleb easily enough, but his eyes shifted quickly to the cabin door when the widow stepped out to bring in wood. She carried the bundle against her chest, her dress still torn at the neckline, despite her attempts to mend it, and her bronze skin glowed in the sharp sun. The trader's eyes narrowed. "That yours?" the man asked bluntly, nodding toward her. Caleb's hand tightened on the rope he held. "She and the girl are under my roof." His tone was calm, steady, but final. The trader smirked faintly, his expression carrying more than curiosity. "Folks in town won't take kindly to that. An Apache woman living with you? They'll talk. Maybe worse." Caleb met his gaze without flinching. "Let them talk." The trader shrugged as if it made no difference to him and focused back on the grain. But Caleb knew the man would carry the story to town before sundown. As the trader left, dust trailing behind, Caleb felt the widow's eyes on him. She had understood enough of the words to know the meaning. "Danger," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Yes, but you're not leaving." His voice carried no doubt. That night, after the girl had fallen asleep, the widow sat by the fire in silence. Her hands moved absently, stroking the rag doll her daughter had clutched since the first night. Finally, she lifted her gaze to Caleb. "You risk for us. Why?" He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He wanted to give her a simple answer, but none came. "Because you belong here now," he said finally. "Because I've lost enough, and I won't lose more if I can stop it." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. She didn't speak further, but the way her hand reached across the small space, brushing his briefly, said enough. The following days confirmed Caleb's fears. A pair of ranchers passed by while he was working the corral. They greeted him, but their eyes lingered on the woman hanging laundry by the cabin. Their smiles carried a sharpness he didn't like. One of them muttered something under his breath. Caleb caught the word, and heat surged through his chest. He didn't confront them then, but the message was clear. Word was spreading, and not kindly. Inside the cabin, the widow grew more aware of the stairs. She began keeping the door bolted when Caleb was gone, her daughter always close by her side. Still, she carried herself with dignity. She did not shrink from work or from looking Caleb in the eye. If anything, the threat outside only seemed to deepen the bond forming between them. They had to trust each other if they were going to face what was coming. One evening, after another long day of work and watchfulness, Caleb sat at the table across from her. The girl slept near the fire. The widow's hair had slipped from its braid, falling over her shoulders in dark strands. Her dress clung to her frame, worn thin but still strong, outlining the shape of her curves. Caleb forced himself to look away, but she noticed. She said nothing, only allowed the silence to stretch between them until finally she whispered, "You think of her," and nodded toward the grave outside. The words caught him off guard. He followed her gaze out the window to the cottonwood. The mound beneath it was faint in the twilight, but he could see it as clearly as if it had been dug yesterday. "Every day," he admitted, his voice rough, unsteady. "I think of what I lost, what I thought I'd never have again." The widow's eyes softened. She leaned closer across the table. "Now you have." She gestured toward her daughter. "Family." Caleb felt the weight of it hit deeply. The silence grew thick, filled with the truth neither of them could deny. Slowly, almost without thought, he reached across the table. She met his hand halfway, their fingers locking. Not tentative this time, but certain. That night, for the first time, she moved her bedding closer to his chair by the fire. They did not speak of it, and when the girl stirred in her sleep, both turned toward her with the same quiet instinct. But when the cabin grew still again, the widow rested her head against Caleb's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her as the fire burned low. He knew then and then that whatever storm the outside world brought, they were bound now, not just by survival, but by choice. The widow and her daughter were no longer guests. They were his family, and come what may, he would face it with them. The days after the trader's visit weighed heavily. Caleb could feel the shift in the air as plainly as the wind across the plains. The land itself hadn't changed. His cattle still needed tending. His fences still sagged under weather, and the water from the creek still ran cold and steady. But people's eyes on him had changed. He felt it when he rode into town for salt and flour, the way men paused their talk when he tied his horse near the mercantile, the way women pulled their children a step closer. He had known judgment before, but this time it was sharper, aimed not at his solitude or his past, but at the woman and child who now lived under his roof. He bought what he needed, ignoring the whispers, but he carried their weight back home with him. The cabin, which had begun to feel like a refuge, now felt like a place under watch. He didn't tell the widow every word that had been said, but she wasn't blind. She saw the tension in his jaw when he returned, the way his eyes scanned the horizon more often, the rifle always leaning close at hand. One afternoon, while the widow mended shirts at the table and her daughter played near the hearth with the doll, Caleb said quietly, "Word's spreading. Town doesn't like it." He didn't look at her when he spoke, busying himself with cutting strips of leather for tack. The widow paused, the needle still in her fingers. "They want us gone." Her English was halting but clear enough. Caleb met her eyes then, steady. "Some might, but it won't happen." She studied him, searching for cracks in his resolve. Finding none, she nodded, though the fear didn't leave her face. Later that night, when she thought he wasn't watching, she sat by the sleeping child with her head bowed, murmuring in her own tongue. Caleb recognized it for what it was, a prayer, not for herself, but for her daughter's safety. He felt his chest tighten. He had given her his word, but words weren't always enough out here. The storm came sooner than he expected. 3 riders showed up late one evening as the sun dipped low. Caleb spotted them from the yard, dust rising behind their horses. They rode with a casual air, but their eyes were sharp. He recognized 2 of them from town, the same ranchers who had muttered under their breath before. The third he didn't know, but the look on his face was enough to tell Caleb he wasn't there to trade pleasantries. "Evening," one called, reining up by the fence. His voice carried a mocking edge. "Heard you've been keeping company. Strange kind of company for a man like you." Caleb stood tall, his hands empty, but his posture firm. "Say what you came to say." The man spat in the dirt. "We don't take kindly to her kind living here. You know it as well as we do. Best send her on her way before folks decide to deal with it for you." Behind him, the cabin door creaked. The widow had stepped out, the child clutching her skirts, eyes wide. Caleb felt heat rise in his chest at the sight of them, exposed to the men's stares. The rancher's gazes lingered on her, sliding over the torn dress, the curve of her figure. Caleb's fist clenched, but he held steady. "She and the girl stay," he said, his voice low and flat. The third rider laughed, a harsh sound. "Ain't no one's gonna let you play house with an Apache and a half-breed kid. You'll bring trouble on yourself, on the all of us." Caleb stepped closer, his gray eyes like stone. "They're under my roof. That means they're mine to protect. You want to test that? Then step off your horse." For a long moment, the air hung tight, the only sound the creak of leather and the faint cry of the wind. The men looked at one another, weighing their chances. Caleb stood unmoving, every inch of his body radiating resolve. Finally, the first rider sneered, "This ain't done, you'll see." They wheeled their horses and rode off, dust rising in their wake. Caleb stood watching until they were gone, then turned back to the cabin. The widow was still at the door, her daughter pressed against her side. Her eyes met his, wide but steady. "You risk again," she said, her voice trembling. He stepped close, his voice gentler now. "I told you, you belong here. I won't let them drive you out." That night, after the child had finally fallen asleep, the widow sat across from Caleb at the fire. The weight of what had happened pressed heavily, but something stronger pushed beneath it. She looked at him long, then spoke softly. "You fight for us, even when danger." "Why?" Caleb leaned forward, his voice low, unflinching. "Because I've already buried too much. I won't bury you too." His jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver. "Because you're not just someone passing through. You and the girl, you're mine now, whether the world likes it or not." The widow's eyes glistened. Slowly, she rose from her seat and crossed the small space between them. She knelt by his chair, her hand resting on his arm. For a moment, neither moved, the firelight flickering across their faces. Then she leaned in, her lips brushing his. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, but when Caleb's hand rose to cup her cheek, she pressed closer, her body leaning into his. It wasn't a kiss born of fear or desperation this time. It was a choice. When they pulled back, Her forehead rested against his, her breath warm. "We stay," she whispered, "together." Caleb closed his eyes briefly, letting the truth of it settle. He had faced death, loss, and silence for years, but this act of staying, of choosing one another in the face of everything, was the hardest and truest thing he had ever done. The cabin, once a hollow shelter against the desert, now held 3 lives bound by the same fragile thread. With each night that passed, that thread grew stronger, not weaker. The morning after the riders had come and gone, the cabin felt different. The air was heavier, not from fear alone, but from certainty. The threat had shown its face, and Caleb knew it would come again in some form. Another visit, sharper words, or worse. But he also knew he had drawn the line clearly, and there was no walking it back. The widow and her daughter were his responsibility now. Not by accident, but by choice. He had said it aloud, and he meant it. The widow moved more quietly that morning, her daughter clinging to her skirts, watchful after the tension of the night before. Caleb took his rifle out with him when he checked the fences, his eyes scanning the horizon more often. He wasn't looking for game, he was looking for men. He found none, only empty land stretching far. But the silence of the prairie no longer felt like comfort. It felt like waiting. When he returned, he found the widow outside, hanging strips of venison to dry on the rack. The torn seam of her dress fluttered in the wind, her hair catching sunlight in dark strands. She glanced at him with a look that was different from before. Not only relief, not only gratitude, but trust. The girl sat in the dirt, pressing shapes into the dust with a stick, humming faintly. The sight struck Caleb more than he expected. After everything, life was still moving forward. That evening, as the fire burned low and the girl slept on her quilt, the widow sat closer than usual. She didn't speak at first, just watched him, her eyes reflecting the flames. Finally, she said, "We safe here." Her voice was quiet, but the weight of it was sharp. Caleb took a long moment before answering. He looked at the child, then at her mother. "Safe enough, not because there's no danger, but because I'll stand between you and it." She nodded slowly, and for the first time, her hand reached out without hesitation. She placed it on his knee, her touch steady. "Then we stay." It was the first time she had spoken the decision aloud, and hearing it lifted something inside him that had been buried for years. He had lived in silence with grief for so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to have a future. The days that followed brought no new riders, no threats, only the steady rhythm of survival. Caleb hunted, chopped wood, repaired fences. The widow cooked, sewed, and tended to her daughter. The girl began calling him Pa one morning without thought, her small voice carrying across the cabin. Caleb froze, the words striking deeply. The widow heard it too, her eyes filling with tears, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was plain. The cabin itself began to change. The widow swept the floor each day, set flowers in a tin by the window, mended old quilts. Caleb built a second bed frame from spare wood, placing it beside his own so the child would no longer sleep on the hearth. He caught himself once standing in the doorway, realizing the place no longer felt like a shell of his grief. It looked like a home again. But questions still lingered, ones anyone listening to their story would wonder. Would Caleb keep hiding them from town forever? Would the widow ever be treated as more than a burden in the eyes of others? Caleb thought about these things often, weighing his past against his present. He decided quietly, firmly, that he didn't care what the town thought. He had lost a wife, an unborn child once, and he would not let the fear of the other men's judgment rob him of this second chance. One night when the wind rattled against the walls, the widow sat close beside him, her daughter already asleep. She turned toward Caleb, her eyes steady. "You lost much," she said softly, "but now you have us." He swallowed, his throat tight. "I do." He reached for her hand, holding it firmly. "And I won't let go." She leaned in then, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was no longer hesitant, no longer born of fear or relief. It was deliberate, certain. Caleb pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, her body pressing against his, as though neither of them would ever be alone again. When they finally parted, she rested her head against his chest, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt peace settle deeply. The following spring, the land turned green after the long cold. Caleb worked the fields while the widow planted herbs by the cabin wall. The girl ran barefoot through the yard, her laughter carrying on the wind. One afternoon, Caleb carved a small wooden figure, two tall shapes and a smaller one between, their hands linked. He set it on the table without a word. When the widow saw it, her hand covered his, her eyes shining with tears she didn't try to hide. That night, with the child asleep in the next room, the widow whispered to him in broken English, "We are family." Caleb kissed her, his lips lingering, his voice low against her ear. And with that, the cabin on the edge of the New Mexico territory, once filled only with silence and loss, now held a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice. The grief that had once buried Caleb had given way to something harder, steadier, and truer. The act of staying. He had chosen them, and they had chosen him. Whatever the world beyond their door thought, it no longer mattered. Inside those walls, they were whole. The story of Caleb and the Apache widow and her daughter delivers a deeply moving lesson. Family is not defined by blood or society's approval, but by the courageous choice to stay and protect those who matter most. Caleb, a rancher haunted by the loss of his wife and unborn child, finds a lost girl, and later her grieving mother, both scarred by violence and abandonment. Despite the risks, judgment from a prejudiced town, threats from outsiders, he chooses to shelter them, not out of duty, but from a shared understanding of loss and a refusal to let more be taken. The widow, resilient yet vulnerable, and her daughter, a symbol of hope, transform Caleb's empty cabin into a home through quiet acts of trust and love. Their bond, forged in the face of danger and sealed by mutual choice, teaches us that true belonging comes from standing firm for those we care about, even when the world pushes back. It's a reminder to open our hearts to unexpected connections, to defy fear and prejudice, and to build a life rooted in love over loss. This tale stirs the soul, urging us to reflect on the moments we've chosen to stay and the people who've made us whole. What does this story awaken in you? Have you ever found family in an unexpected place? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're eager to hear your stories. If this tale touched your heart, please subscribe and join our community for more stories that inspire courage and connection. Let's keep this journey of hope alive.